Father John, it's great to have you again. Thanks so much for joining us for round two of our conversation.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, yeah, and so we're going to be talking about unity, diversity, and the Trinity today. And I think we're going to divide this conversation into two parts. The first part, we may not talk about the Trinity as much, but the second part, we very much will. The first part, I want to discuss the question, what is good diversity? Or like,
Mm,
what is good or true or right or authentic diversity?
mhm,
And in exploring this question with you, I'm going to draw upon some of your statements from two essays that you've written in your diocesan newspaper on this question of diversity, because you, like us, have recognized that diversity is in the zeitgeist and you want to deal with it in a sophisticated manner informed by Christianity and Catholicism. So, here are just a couple of kind of
mm,
specific questions that fall under this theme of what is good or true or right or authentic
mm.
diversity. And we'll just kind of see what comes out of your answers to this. And it might give you an opportunity to present maybe an overall answer to that question or not. Either way is fine. So I'll start here. You write in one of your essays, not every difference leads to true diversity.
Mm.
Playing golf with a basketball is not a diverse way to play golf. It is a way to introduce chaos and destroy the game. Now, this reminded me of a talk that I saw Father Mike Schmitz gave, or that I saw Father Mike Schmitz give at a Steubenville youth conference, in which he was discussing the issue of same-sex marriage.
Mm.
And the basic argument, as I recall, was that allowing same-sex marriage would sort of be like trying to play golf with a basketball. I think he even said,
Those things.
say again.
He used that image too.
He used a similar image. It was something like um, joining a baseball game
Yeah.
and then saying that you don't agree with the rules of baseball and
Mm.
using some other set of rules. In other words, you're fundamentally redefining the game. And anyway, I was curious if you had something like that in mind implicitly when you mentioned playing golf with the
Mm.
basketball as a kind of funny, illustrative example of a difference that is not really true diversity. But let me just put the ball, the basketball in your court and have you kind of respond to this issue.
Yeah. Um, I'm not sure exactly where I'm sure I stole it from somewhere. I don't either Father Mike Schmitz or Father or Bishop Barron. Um, as an image, I think you could have, applied a lot of contexts. And the point that at least I was trying to make with that image of a basketball for a golf ball, showing how there is a kind of difference that just doesn't fit within the harmony of the whole. That's essentially the point. Not every difference can be integrated. Some difference will destroy the whole. And you could make a golf ball a little bit smaller, a little bit larger, or like do something like baseball, for example. Baseball is a game that can flex in different directions. You can make the ball a little bigger, and you have, a version of baseball that's softball. It hasn't destroyed the game. You can still have a batter, you can still have a pitcher, you could still throw to bases and things. So that's maybe a way of seeing a kind of accidental difference in the size of the ball that doesn't destroy the unity of the game. But if you enlarge to a softball from a baseball, it works. But if you enlarge to a basketball from a golf ball, it doesn't work. You have to destroy the current game and create a new one. So if wherever I got the image or however else you could apply it, I think that the point is ultimately that diversity, at least in a first philosophical thesis, I would say diversity only makes sense, or we can only speak of a positive idea of diversity if it's within a harmony, a unity. I think you could think of other examples, like you maybe think of ecology, for example. So like you could have many different species, wildly different species, that all have a symbiotic, ecologically harmonious relationship within the whole of their environment. Um, and those you could, however, introduce a species that is so different, that it ends up destroying the whole. And we would no longer call that diversity, I think. I think people would recognize that's an alien, that's an alien species and an invader, right? We would recognize, we would use new words at that point. We wouldn't say, "Oh, what a neat dinosaur." Like, no, it's destroying everything. So I don't know. Does that help as a kind of a
Yeah,
philosophical thrust there?
yeah, and I think Father Mike Schmitz was making an argument sort of like that about same-sex marriage. I mean, I'm not sure how far you could take the analogy, the ecological analogy, in the sense that I'm not sure Mike Schmitz would argue that introducing same-sex couples into the institution of marriage would destroy the institution of marriage in the same way that an invasive
Mhm.
species might destroy some ecology. So I don't know how far he would take that ecological analogy, but I
Yeah.
do think that
I
yeah,
suspect he's sorry to cut you off, but
yeah,
I suspect that he's pointing out that it is a fundamental redefinition. That it is, if you admit into the category of marriage, same-sex unions, you have destroyed the category and replaced it with another. At least as we have understood the word marriage. It was not simply any friendship. It was not simply any um, sexually, I don't even want to use, but really want to be specific. I don't even want to use the word sexual. It's
mhm.
not really a sexual relationship because sex is predicated on the idea of difference. I read that etymology somewhere and I wish I could recall it for you, but sex ultimately comes from a word that means difference. We speak about sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. That is a kind of reproduction that's based on of a difference, a complementary difference, or a kind of reproduction where you don't need that difference. Asexual life reproduces without a male female binary. It's just the life that can somehow, do itself. And so I don't even want to call same sex unions sexual unions, you
Mhm.
know? And this is a level of thinking that, I don't think most people go, it's even the problem of language is even, deeper than calling it marriage. It's calling it sexual. So anyway, I think that the bigger point that if I understand Father Mike to be making is that if you call that a marriage, you have changed the meaning of marriage, and that is an admission into the category of a difference that destroys the category.
That etymology you were reaching for, Father John, sex, right? It shares a root with sect, right, or a
Mm.
bisection or something like that, right? So the idea
Yeah.
of a split into complementary parts that make up one whole, right? Like if we bisect a sphere or something like that into two hemispheres. Um, yeah, well, I was thinking about exactly the point of this sports analogy. I guess the way I was thinking of it, right, would be that the objection would be that if we introduce a basketball into baseball, right, then the one of the social harms is that we make it harder for people to recognize what baseball is, the game
Mm-hmm.
of baseball, the institution of baseball, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that well, then you have to take the further step of being able to recognize something that's not true of baseball, but which is true of marriage, which is the very fundamental good that this is in relationship to the human society as a whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that in the measure that it becomes harder for people to recognize what this institution is, what this good consists in, and the vital good that it provides to the human community beyond itself. Um, in that measure, there's further harm being done to the fabric of society. Does that track in terms of the point of the analogy there?
I think what you're introducing is a more subtle form. So if I'm understanding you right, it's admitting that the basketball doesn't destroy the game, but it can make it confusing to appreciate the game. I think Father Mike's point is it destroys the game. Something that fits what you're saying. Maybe like I'm just spitballing here, but like let's say culturally we agreed that marriage is still, a permanent, indissoluble union between a man and a woman for the sake of life and of friendship and so forth. But then we said culturally, however, we're going to accept that men and women, that husbands and wives can sleep in beds that don't belong to the husbands and wives. That, you know, like, oh, they're not going to have a sexual relationship, but don't be surprised if you see Mrs. Jones coming out of Mr. Thompson's bedroom, you know, in the morning. And they're not going to do anything, but like all of a sudden this is happening. And you know, it sure does look strange if what we're affirming is, you know, this permanent exclusive, you know, union. And but culturally we're okay with that. So it would seem to me that that would be an example where it makes it harder to see culturally and harder to support culturally. You know, technically speaking, you haven't broken the category, but but it's not a form of life that really nourishes our perception of the reality. In fact, it could be a cultural habit that can preclude our perception of the reality and even put us in situations where we would, you know, put ourselves at risk of transgressing the reality.
I always try to put myself in the position of someone who supports same-sex marriage or someone who supports other forms of diversity that might not be considered good or true or right from a Catholic perspective. And it would be, I think, from the perspective you've laid out, progress, a form of progress, if a supporter of same-sex marriage agreed that they were proposing a redefinition of the term marriage.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, no, we're not redefining marriage, we're just expanding it or something, or, you know, we're making it more inclusive. Because if they said, I agree with you, we are redefining marriage.
Yeah.
We think it used to be a bad game, a bad concept, a bad definition, and we're making it into a good game, a good definition, a good concept. Then that would become the debate.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that right? But that would at least be a kind of progress versus someone not even acknowledging that they've changed the definition.
Definitely. Definitely. And that, I think that I mean, I don't know, you know, how cynical I want to be, but I think the way in which the argument has unfolded has shown either a kind of willful ignorance in order to kind of manipulate society and get what they want, or it's shown just how poor the defense of marriage was. Because when someone said love is love, we all scratched our heads and be like, oh gosh, he's right, you know, and didn't realize that, well, yes, love is love, but that's a much larger category than marriage. You know, you can love people who aren't your spouse. And because we somehow didn't make that inference and just accepted the redefinition of marriage without realizing it, you know, it went culturally as quickly as it did.
I do think that the understanding of what marriage is degraded substantially over the course of 50 to 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
If you polled Americans and asked them what is marriage, very few would, you know, say it's a union oriented toward the creation and nurturing of life. Like very,
Permanent,
you know,
and exclusive. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so let's stay on this for a second. Not on marriage, but I think a kind of related issue. So you wrote in another essay, maybe it was the same one. Okay, and again, we're kind of staying within this category of what is good or true or authentic diversity,
Mm-hmm.
and that led to, you know, you said that playing golf with a basketball is not a diverse way to play golf. It's a way to introduce chaos and destroy the game. And this kind of led us into a conversation about whether same-sex marriage might be analogous. So we had a discussion there, but that's all kind of within this question of what is good diversity? Is same-sex marriage a good form of diversity, or is it more destructive than positive? We talked about that a little bit. Now I want to shift to another topic within this broad question of what is good or true or right diversity. So you wrote an example of the idolization of diversity, and I'm paraphrasing here. So I'm paraphrasing here. You wrote, an example of the idolization of diversity is how adamantly some insist that sexuality and gender can be redefined and multiplied without any regard for biological reality. What matters to some is that their alleged difference is affirmed at all costs, even at the cost of truth and unity. Now, again, as I was reading this and thinking about what we might discuss, I was putting myself in the position of, again, a supporter of, let's say, modern gender theory, or someone who is very wants to be very inclusive of different sexual inclinations or orientations, and is very open to the idea that gender identity is quite separate and independent
Mhm.
from biological sex. So a person like that,
Sure.
what they would say to this, and they of course would contest the notion that these positions they hold run counter to truth or unity.
Mm.
Obviously, they would say that no, gender identity, in fact, is separate and
Yeah.
independent from biological sex. And people are same-sex attracted and have a wide variety of sexual inclinations. Those things are just true. And we're not against unity. In fact, we are not against people being cisgender. We are not against people being heterosexual. We simply want those people to include us who have maybe less common sexual inclinations or gender identities, like
Yeah.
we in the trans community, or we in the LGBT community more broadly. So I'll just kind of again throw the ball to you.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you posed the questions that people will ask, and try to give them a voice in a conversation like this, lest we run away too easily with our own convictions. And to sort of strengthen that position one more notch, if I can try, I would say that my suspicion is that a lot of the reaction we have against natural sexuality has come from a cultural construct that I would recognize A, as a cultural construct, and C, as something illegitimate and harmful for an authentic diversity. So I'm thinking in particular of gender stereotyping. We do culturally have Barbie and Ken ways of thinking of men and women that can be unfairly and I would say irrationally exclusive. And someone can be made to feel less a woman or less a man because they don't conform to some idea of a the ideal man or the ideal woman. They don't fit some constructed and narrow definition. And so I do think there can be a healthy rebellion against certain social constructs. The story I like to tell when I make this point is when I was a young kid, and I, had the chance to be part of a school band. And I had listened to classical music with my mother, when I was young in elementary school and everything. And the instrument that just spontaneously appealed to me was the flute. And I think I was in like third grade, something like that. And so I got to choose the instrument, and I chose the flute. And little did I know that that was a girl's instrument. And so I was just mercilessly teased and came home crying several weeks. And, to the point where I just said, forget it. I'll switch to the drums. And a couple weeks later, I quit music altogether. So I was like super sad. God takes care of me, so I'm okay. But it's true that we have these stupid cultural stereotypes, and they can be very important to combat. Now, so I want to acknowledge as much as I can that point. However, if diversity is something that's going to be genuinely life-giving and promoting unity, it should be something that we're able to share. It should be grounded in truth, and truth is something shareable. Truth is not the private possession of somebody. It's one of those goods that we can all chow down on infinitely without ever consuming. And so I would say that a diversity that is unanchored in, what I would call objective reality, or the natural world that we share, and is rooted only in this like inscrutable self-perception of the person that I am X, and that can change, from day to day. It just seems to me that is much more easily explained by some other mechanism. Mechanism is the wrong word. By some other, psychological or philosophical error, than to say that no, they really are that, and we all ought to respect it. It seems much more reasonable to say, well, here's the world that we all share and gaze at together. Let's try to see it together and articulate it together. Maybe that's too abstractly stated, and the point is just quite simple. Like, there is a biological reality out there. Let's try to know it. And sure, sometimes there can be these rare conditions that are sincerely ambiguous. that it's difficult to tell, especially if you haven't yet thought philosophically enough about how you're going to perceive a gender. Is it simply anatomical? Is it simply chromosomal? Like, what are you defining as the male and defining as the female? Um, you know, Never mind what would then be a male or female that is one way or another ill or suffers from a condition. So acknowledging that sometimes, in this veil of tears, that we can have a situation that is difficult to discern or ambiguous. Nonetheless, I think if we're going to speak about diversity in a way that anchors it to a truth that's shareable, we must be ready together to look at and gaze upon the natural world and identify the forms that I think are so clearly there for us to see, despite whatever ambiguities there might be in the rare cases.
And just to follow up on that, there's an important distinction here between same-sex attraction and gender identity, because I think same-sex attraction is objectively real in a way that gender identity is not. Critics of homosexuality or homosexual behavior obviously don't deny that it takes place, or that same-sex attraction exists. The debate there is whether it's permissible or good. And that is a trickier, that's a more complex argument to make, obviously.
Yeah, I follow, and I think I agree. Like, gender identity is not the same as sexual attraction, because sexual attraction is, an assertion about like how I'm feeling, like how I'm affected. I'm affectively desiring this, and it's like, okay, only a self-reporting being. I have to learn that from you. You have to report that. I could say what's natural or what would be healthy for your organism as a male or a female, but only you can tell me how you feel. And so that makes sense to me. But you're right that that's different from then canonizing that as the way to go and as not something to be to be shaped in a different way. Whereas gender identity, if what they're making is that ontological claim, I am, a female when I am biologically a male, that is a claim that can be disputed. That's not simply the reporting of how I feel. That's like the effort to make a metaphysical claim, which can be subjected to the analysis of other rational minds. It's not like I'm currently thinking of a cloud, On the other hand, there could be someone who says, like, I feel like a woman, or I feel like a man, as I understand those terms to be. Or, this person thinks like a woman or thinks like a man. If we want to identify typically masculine, typically feminine ways of thinking and perceiving, it seems to me that we could legitimately say that a man could think in a moment like a woman, without ceasing to be a man. That's just a way of recognizing that masculinity and femininity are both, manifestations of a common humanity.
Yeah, I'm just starting to think about this a little bit more, and I think that I may have overstated the case, because I think gender dysphoria is objectively real. A sense of alienation from your own body.
That's right.
So same-sex attraction, same-sex behavior, same-sex sexual behavior, or not sexual, same-sex, whatever you want to call it. Okay.
It's important to find the right words.
Yeah, no, it's great, because the more you think about the words, the more clearly you end up thinking. But anyway, so let's just call it same-sex attraction, same-sex behavior.
Yeah.
That's real. Gender that is objectively real. Gender dysphoria, my understanding is that it too is objectively real, right? And so really in both cases, the question is like, what do you do with these feelings and impulses?
Right.
Yeah.
Just
please,
by way
Mark.
of clarification, then maybe we've arrived at this point. Isn't it the case, both in the case of homosexuality and claims of transgender status on the other hand, won't it be the case in both scenarios that there's, on the one hand, a set of feelings or a desire or a felt inclination or something like that on the one hand, and on the other hand, the kind of concepts that are being brought to bear to interpret these feelings or experiences or desires on the other, so that we could then, open up the question: have we been bringing to bear the right concepts or the right claims or understandings to interpret these desires and feelings
Yeah.
in the way that's going to be healing for the people or truly fulfilling for the people that report them.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. You know, uh, people who have gender dysphoria, I want to have compassion on them. Like that's an immense suffering. And we should as a community be trying to find right ways to help them. And to help them, I imagine, I think for good reason, that the course of healing will involve integration. It will involve helping them in their affectivity, their feelings, their self-understanding, to be able to take this experience and shape it in a way that serves the larger whole of their being a bodied person. It's hard to have feelings and desires that pull you in a direction that is at odds with the good that your body is just naturally ordered toward. I imagine that that's a very difficult suffering if I, as a man, am ordered toward procreation, among other things, obviously, but ordered toward procreation with a woman, and my desires don't lead me to want that. It leads me to want something else. It would be much more harmonious, and I would experience my integral good so much more if all my thoughts, all my feelings, the bodily integrity that I have, if all of that were just in alignment. And anytime that's out of step, there is a suffering. And you're right that it's important to help people to find the right language to name correctly what they're experiencing as best we can. Um, I can think, for example, this happened a while ago, and I'm forgetting all the details, but I remember a little kid once came to me, and he said, I'm manic depressive. I'm bipolar, I think he used the word. And I was thinking, like, I'm pretty sure he doesn't understand those words. And if I were to try then to help him in that moment, by taking seriously the vocabulary that he used, I would probably cause more harm. When I learned that, oh, he just didn't do well on a test, and he was crying and experiencing a very natural disappointment and sadness, but had labeled it with this really loaded clinical term. Uh, if I had treated him at the level of that clinical term and not helped him find a better word, like I'm sad, then I would have harmed him further, I think.
As I heard the way you were articulating it this time, Father John, I was reminded of the tradition of the Desert Fathers and the Greek Fathers, the Greek monastics, of
Hmm.
naming our temptations. And Evagrius of Pontus is someone I think of sometimes, talking about in his Greek the logismoi, or the thoughts,
Hmm.
which are kind of the
Hmm.
beginning of our temptations. And
Hmm.
if we can learn to identify them, then we can cut them off,
Oh
right? And
yeah,
we can cut them off with a prayer, or
yeah,
in
yeah.
that tradition. I think there's probably, there's what's the word I'm looking for, application in these sorts of areas,
Yeah.
or some cross fertilization that could happen.
Absolutely. What one of my, you know, projects that one day I would love to have time to pursue is the integration of psychology and spirituality. And I do think there is a discipline of psychology with its own relative autonomy and sphere. But right now, my impression anyway is that it's a bit overstepping, and I think there's a lot of spiritual experience that is being misnamed in psychological terms. And what we experience as sadness or mania or things like that are probably often more properly classified with spiritual categories like despair or sadness or asadia or a vanity. I mean, I know I've experienced times where I've been sad or frustrated, and if I've just thought about it more, it's like, well, it's just because you want something that's wrong to want. Submit your will to the good and you'll be all right. And, once I accept to work against a sinful inclination and submit my will to a larger providence and therefore let go what I was unable to have, I'm not sad anymore. I'm on the contrary. I feel wildly in communion with the universe and its creator.
It tends to be power, pleasure, wealth, or honor. One of
Yeah,
those four
exactly.
that we're wanting.
Exactly. And when we
Yeah,
don't get it, we
yeah,
ignore our own hearts and their attachment to those things and the role that our freedom is playing in making ourselves psychologically unhappy. And we project it onto external forces. And so limit the possibilities for our happiness.
yeah. And I mean, I really like what Marcus said about finding the right concepts. And with regard to same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria, we, the three of us, would probably think it's important to say this person experiences same-sex attraction rather than to say this person is gay. It's an important distinction. Similarly, it's probably better to say this person suffers from gender dysphoria than to say this person is trans or something like that. Because you're conceding a lot by using the latter formulation in both cases. And so, yeah, I think it's a really good point, Marcus.
I suspect, I'm just here trying to think as best I can with y'all, but I suspect that we can interpret that is in two different ways, one of which I would find acceptable given what we said, one of which I wouldn't given what we've said. There are other languages, like Spanish, ser and estar, two forms of to be. One of them has a more essentialist connotation. The other one has a more accidental connotation. And so if I meant, he is gay, like I meant he is happy, he could be currently experiencing a positive emotion. Then I think you could say he is gay. He is currently experiencing a particular attraction. He is hungry. He is whatever. But if you were to say like he is, I don't know, a Homo sapiens, or he is an animal with a rational soul or something like that. And then in that sense of is, that more metaphysical, ontological sense, like he is gay, well, then I would say, no, I don't want to put that into his nature, into his inalienable substance, such that, he would be destroyed if he were no longer gay, just like he wouldn't be destroyed if he were for a moment sad as opposed to happy.
The good thing about the phrase experiences same-sex attraction is that it just eliminates that ambiguity.
Yeah.
It makes very clear what you are describing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in a philosophical sense, that's much closer. I do find though that in pastoral situations, in regular speech with people, sometimes it's important to have to leave some tolerance for the way people describe themselves. I try to avoid such language, but I don't jump in and, quote unquote, correct people, because oftentimes they're meaning something, more like, I think, at least what we're suggesting, rather than this, grand metaphysical claim. Although sometimes they are, and, you just have to prudentially try to help them as best you can and treat the order of topics in a sequence that will really benefit them.
My takeaway from this last exchange, Father John, is this: it turns out that the logic of predication can actually help your life.
Yes.
It makes a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
The last thing that I wanted to address under the category of what is true, good, right, authentic diversity is something you wrote that struck me. I had never thought about the issue of diversity in quite this way or using this language, and I just think it's useful to name and discuss. So you wrote, when we seek diversity apart from God on our own terms or for its own sake, we make division and disorder. But when we receive diversity from God as a gift given for his purposes, we enjoy it as something leading to a rich and harmonious unity. So what I want to focus on here is the seek diversity apart from God versus receive diversity from God. And even more specifically, like what I had never thought about was the seek receive distinction. To seek diversity is distinct from to receive diversity.
Yeah.
And the sort of connotations of those two terms, it was very suggestive and stimulating for me. So again, let me just give the ball to you, and maybe you can elaborate a bit on this line, and in particular on the seek versus receive, and maybe, seek apart from God versus receive from God.
Yeah. So I think that that idea of receiving diversity is an effort to shift something really fundamental in the way we think of philosophy. So usually, at least if I'm just being very quick and generalizing, a lot of modern philosophy sort of skips entirely this contemplative moment where, to think philosophically, I need to open my eyes and receive and wonder at what's out there and receive the impressions of things upon me and then humbly try to name them. That moment seems to be passed over pretty quickly, if not ignored entirely, in order to turn nature into raw material for the gadgets and the projects of my own will, to be masters and possessors of nature, whether you're Descartes or Bacon, thinking of knowledge as power, or Marx thinking that, in the past, philosophers wanted to know and interpret the world. Now we want to change it. Here I think I'm riffing on like Joseph Pieper and many others who would just recognize that there was a massive shift in the history of philosophy when we stopped trying to receive being and instead started to create this world of our own. And diversity, I think, is one of many goods in the world that we should receive. If we look out upon the world contemplatively, peacefully, without an agenda, without trying to reduce it to the raw material of my own making, then you encounter a wildly gorgeous array of forms and creatures, the limits of which we've not even come close to cataloging. That's cool. And it is beautiful to see this kind of tree and that kind of tree, to receive it. And then, at the human level too, the many different kinds of people, different skills, tall people, short people, strong people, like all different gifts that, when you meet a new person and you realize that he or she is different from you in some way that is genuinely enriching, it's fun. And then, most paradigmatically, perhaps in the friendship between man and woman, where the differences between them are so profound, and before which, both men and women ought to be very humble. That is the reception of diversity, where I don't try to take my wife and just because she doesn't think exactly like I do, try to force her into my way of thinking. It's like, no, well, maybe you should just receive her as other and like see where you go together, mutually enriching each other instead of trying to find your peace by reducing her into a carbon copy of yourself. So I think on a very natural level, that's what I mean by receiving diversity, is just this openness to natural forms, humble openness. Then, of course, on the supernatural level, that there's another sense to that. So St. Paul, in those, as I mentioned, those essays, talks about, the descent of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And, to one he gives administration, to another teaching, to another interpretation, another tongues and miracles and prophecies. And each one of those gifts is given for the sake of the building up of the body. And a wise church is a church that is always going to be on the lookout for these gifts. What is the Holy Spirit sending us for the building up of the body? And thus, I shouldn't have this ecclesial plan or pastoral plan that leaves me as the master of it and is closed now to the possibility that God might send me something unexpected. And therefore, I should receive what is different, what is other, what is diverse.
And what about seeking diversity apart from God?
Yeah. I think that when we seek diversity apart from God, I think what I mean there is that we eliminate this idea of reception. So the only one who I think can authoritatively give us diversity is the one who is in charge of the larger whole. Like we were saying earlier, a difference that does not serve the whole is something that destroys, right? And in as much as we don't really know the whole, we are not able to determine in full measure, like what's healthy diversity or not. Like we have to kind of wait a lot of the times, see how things play out, whether they really do serve life, whether they are consistent with the life that we know. And I think that means that ultimately you have to be trying to identify and promote diversity with this humble reference to the creator, to the providential governor of all things. And if you don't have that reference point, you are trying to find diversity in relation to some idol or your own will, or you've just given up altogether on the idea of a diversity that promotes the edification of the body. So that the idea of seeking diversity in relation to God humbles us because you recognize that I don't really know, the whole, where we're going as a mystical body, what creation is all there for. The Alpha and Omega is revealed to me in Christ, but that is still a mystery that transcends the finite grasp of my mind. And so I shouldn't consider myself as the final measuring rod that's able to say, oh, your gift is good, your gift is not. You might be surprised. You should respect the dignity of that person, and kind of like this comes like Lord of the Rings style. So, Gollum. Gandalf has that fantastic line about not being so quick to dispense death and judgment to Frodo. And Frodo says, like, why didn't they kill him earlier? Even the very wise cannot see all ends. And so what part Gollum has to play in the story of the whole? Well, you find out at the end where Frodo's weakness morally inhibits him from destroying the ring. And it's only this incredible dance of two sinners through which God is able to act to finally destroy the ring. So like, let's none of us take the position of the creator to be the final arbiter. But all the while humbly be on the lookout for how these diverse gifts will build into a unity.
So I want to shift now to the second big question related to diversity that we wanted to discuss. And the way I put it in my notes is it doesn't even make reference to the Trinity or to God. It's just the question, how do we know it's possible to unite unity and diversity? And how do we know it's desirable?
Mm-hmm.
And if I understand your perspective correctly, it is that if you don't have a Trinitarian perspective, it's not clear why you should think it's possible or desirable to unite unity and diversity, or to seek unity and diversity. And more specifically, you note in one of your essays that Aristotle suggests that it's not possible to grasp transcendent unity. It's beyond our categories. Plato takes the view that diversity is undesirable. It's a mark of fallenness. I think you suggest that modern secularism doesn't even understand the question being posed here. It is indifferent to metaphysics. It simply asserts whatever it values on a given day. So in other words, these non-theistic or non-Trinitarian theistic perspectives don't really furnish grounds for considering unity and diversity both possible and desirable. And so I'll just quote a few more lines from you, and then I'll just kind of invite you to respond. You write, "The dream of being both one and many stems from a theological hope, something the secular world cannot justify by itself. For by what reason do we try to unify a world of such different peoples? Who tells us that it is even possible for us to be one, and that we ought to spend our efforts for such a family? Why don't we give up hope and retreat into the loneliness of anxious self-protection? Christians confess the Trinity, the absolute origin and end of all, who is divine communio, or communio, is able to embrace every person by name into a common life. In this way and in so many others, it just seems so clear that Christians have the reason for what everyone deep down is hoping for." Elsewhere, you write, "Looking at the Trinity, we see unity and diversity are not things to be balanced quantitatively as if they competed in a zero-sum game. They are ineffably reconciled in God." So again, in short, you're suggesting that from these non-Trinitarian or non-theistic perspectives, it's not clear that unity and diversity is possible or desirable, but from a Trinitarian perspective, it is clear. So let me just hand the ball to you.
Yeah, so this seems to me to be a really strong thesis, strong both in the sense that I think there's good evidence for it, although I have to confess my own limits in the history of religion and philosophy. So I need to learn more. But from what I do know, it seems to be a strong thesis to say that there's nothing like the Christian claim about the Trinity. And it's pretty easy to see how the Christian claim about the Trinity is this assertion of reconciled unity and diversity that gives us a right to hope that those are absolute. You know, if God is not that, well, then that is not absolute because God is the only absolute, right? You know, you can't have more than one absolute. So that seems to be a strong thesis there, both evidentially, but then also just strong for its life-giving power. Like, I mean, I do think that people want this, and you know, I don't know if I'm a full Ronarian with the ideas of anonymous Christianity and so forth, but I think there are a lot of, in some sense, anonymous Christians who deep down are hoping for the triune God without recognizing it because they, on the one hand, so long righteously for personal dignity, and that we're not all just instances of a type, you know, human being number one, number two, number three, but, you know, Tom, Dick, Harry, Sally, Jane, whatever, and that has an ontological depth that really matters. You're irreplaceable as a human being. We have an instinct for that. You know, where it all comes from is a whole other question, but it's there, I think. And I think it's a large part behind of a lot of the championing of diversity. You know, this insistence that I matter, and that's, I think, in an important sense, is beautiful. But it obviously can become very frightened and angry and defensive, and thus irrational when it starts to resist all you know, efforts to bring the one into harmony with the many. Um, and so you have, I think, also culturally many people who want to accent unity, which is also a great truth of being, that there is a harmony of all things, and we do want to find our place within a whole rather than just scattering across. And so to help those people searching for unity, I think the Trinity also helps. And I don't see, again, another worldview that helps. You know, my understanding of Aristotle is limited, but I think this is true, and I'm open to being corrected, that, you know, the categories of being are the categories of being, and he doesn't have that existential insight into the why is something rather than nothing, you know, a creation ex nihilo, a kind of transcendent, you know, outside all category, ultimate that all being stems from, you know, God beyond being kind of thing. And so there's the 10, an unreconciled diversity. And then there's the Platonic, which, you know, seems everything all traces back to the form of the good, and then a Neoplatonism like the one, and then everything that comes after that is a kind of fall. You know, so negative is this language in Neoplatonism that, you know, it can enter into a kind of Christian worldview with fallenness, and the origin in Neoplatonism can be very, very close and seemingly indistinguishable, and thus problems occur for Origin and his effort to articulate Christian faith and so forth. So yeah, you know, at least in those two major philosophical sources of the West, you know, you see this problem of unity and diversity. And then I think in our own contemporary zeitgeist, which I think is in large part very Nietzschean, you know, he's openly polytheistic in a sense. Like, Nietzsche has these great passages where he rails against monotheism because he understands it as a reduction to a single norm, and he longs for a time where, you know, a more honest, life-affirming polytheism where each person had his own God and was unabashedly for it. So that seems to me to be a way of understanding life and human relationships that gives up the idea of unity, and not only gives up the idea of unity, but sees it as something fundamentally harmful, as life destroying. And that seems to me to be where a lot of our contemporary culture is that the idea of norm, like that's a dirty word for a lot of people. Norm and nature, those are ugly words for people because they feel so person threatening. If there's a norm out there, somehow that's a threat to me being who I am as an individual person. These are sad ways to be. sad ways to be. I mean, if you get rid of the idea of norm and nature, you have ipso facto gotten rid of all categorical thinking and therefore logical thought. And, Nietzsche's okay with that, but I'm not. And I think most people today, when they recognize the connections, they're also not okay with that. A lot of people, even many of those cultural Nietzscheans, say at least that they like science, even though Nietzsche also had doubts about that kind of stuff. So anyway, we're in a difficult world where there is not a very clear metaphysical foundation for what we all long for: intelligibility, unity, harmony, and yet a harmony that doesn't cancel personal dignity and my right to a name, as opposed to just human being number one. So yeah. And we can go more, I think, about how the Trinity does that, but at a first response, it does seem to me to be the case that the Trinity offers that hope.
I just, to begin with, want to interject briefly on the subject of Nietzsche's place in all of this. We have to remember he did say, right, that grammar itself is one of the shadows of God, right?
Yeah.
On the subject of norms and concepts, and even sort of the way that our natural language is itself already a kind of latching on to reality.
Yeah.
But to rewind the tape a little bit, I just wanted to emphasize some of the points you were making, Father John, in comparison with Platonism, because I do think even if there aren't a whole lot of card-carrying Platonists out there today, there is still a lot to be mined in that contrast there. When I think of the points you were making about the one, right? The idea that for this later Platonic tradition, difference and diversity in a way that's already kind of falling short of the one source of all things, the transcendent good, so that there's something to be lamented in a sense about the ways in which we are less than perfectly one, less than perfectly simple. If that's your picture, then yes, following God's will or trying to grow more into conformity with God can seem very conformist, can seem like if I'm going down this path, then I'm kind of losing my own identity more and more. And as we all go down that journey, the differences between us collapse and we become more conformed, more homogenized. But it's a whole revolutionary difference then when you say, as you were articulating it, Father John, that sameness and difference are both equally primeval in God's nature, and God is Trinity. It's not the case that as I go down God's path for me, or as I try to grow an imitation of God, that I lose my own true identity or lose my own, what's truly good and diverse in my personal identity, right? And we can look at the examples of the saints, right? If we look at the examples of the canonized saints, I don't think many of us would make the mistake of thinking that they were all just like each other in every respect. They're actually
That's
very
right.
So on that point, do you think that there's a particular word that as Catholics or even as Christians, as Trinitarians, we can offer to others, people that we might have disagreements with, or just people who religion hasn't really been a part of how they think about these questions? A word of hope, a word that shows people, that can help people begin to see, taking religion seriously or taking God seriously doesn't mean losing out on the differences or the true diverse goods that are worth celebrating. Actually, it enriches it. Precisely as the saints grow closer to God, they become more radiantly themselves. Do you think that there's something there to be offered to others?
Absolutely. I would probably encourage people to be open to the possibility that they may not really have heard the Christian God, like the God that they think they know, however it was they got that idea, may not be what the gospel is announcing. And so to be more curious when they try to understand Christianity. And I have to say that, but at the same time, it's not a judgment on them, because oftentimes we have been our worst advocates. We've not done a good job. And so to encourage them by just being open, and then to push them to search for a helpful presentation of the gospel that does that does correspond to the truth that they're seeking, which is a genuine one. And then just in very broad strokes, I would say is just, maybe thinking like a fundamental theologian or something. Like I would say, okay, let's just begin maybe with 2 points. One is the Christian God is the creator. Like we're talking about the one who's responsible for the whole. So just go hike in your mountains, you're spiritual but not religious. That's fine for now. Like go have your experience out there. And just you tell me, do you think that the absolute is a monolith? Or do you think he might himself be not just one, but many? Or another point, so you go commune in nature and you kind of have a hope for a creator that is like this. But then the second point I would say is like just think of history and think of narrative. You folks who love literature, who love story, personal drama and things like this. There too, imagine for a moment, what if all of space and time was a novel, so to speak? And just like you love and cherish the different characters in this series and how they all played a part in achieving the great end, like what if like the one who created all the trees and the bugs and all their differences also created the manifold that we see across history and was so providential in his organization of those different creatures and persons that they were able to come to be in their uniqueness as a creature precisely in the measure that they contributed to the collective end. Wouldn't such an author be worth worshiping? Wouldn't it be beautiful if our human history had such an author? When you put those two things together, now you have a little bit better of an idea of what Christians call God, or the one Christians call God.
Yeah, and I think symphonies and orchestral music, or more broadly, just musical harmony, is another great analogy, kind of like the novel.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, definitely. And you would never squish the flautist in order to have all drums, right?
Even if it's a male flautist.
Even if it's a male flautist.
So maybe I could start us off with one of the passages from your 2 pieces that I found most rich for my own reflection, where you bring in the Trinity as a mystery that can shed light on unity and diversity as human goods.
Yeah.
So I'll just read the passage out, and then I'll follow up with my question. So you write, the gospel proclaims the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, 3 persons in one God, the unity in diversity that is the Trinity. Unity and diversity are co-primordial in God. He is not some monolithic one that unfolds in diversity at a later moment, second to his true nature, nor is he some 3 who later try to steer their independence into a unity that is, in the end, only some addition to their fundamental identities apart from each other. The Father is Father of the Son from all eternity. He is Father eternally. As God, he was never not the Father. Just so, each person of the Trinity is the one God, and yet as the one God is diverse from the other 2. So that idea that unity and sameness and difference, or the one and the 3 are co-primordial in God, I take it you identify as the key to kind of the distinctive Catholic contribution to how we think about the good of true diversity together as American citizens or as fellow human beings. So just to get our conversation started off then, in light of that passage, Father John, could you just maybe get us started by summing up your view of how the Trinity makes a difference to the way that we approach the topic of diversity?
Yeah. So the first is the one that comes out in that passage where if you worship the Christian God, you're committed to the co-primordial character of unity and diversity. You can't sacrifice one to the other. You can't reduce one to the other. You can't pursue a unity that doesn't have diversity and likewise. So I write that just as to make sure that everyone understands the goal and doesn't think that it's really about unity, and maybe we'll have as a pastoral strategy some concession to, the contemporary interest in diversity, but really it's about unity, or the other. So to encourage Catholics to be open to the word diversity, and to see it as something that we're committed to. A second piece, which doesn't quite come out in that quote, is the nature of the unity and diversity given the Trinity. So, let's maybe begin taking a step back. Like, we think we know what unity means, and maybe we don't. And similarly, we think we know what diversity means, and maybe we don't. There's actually a lot of different kinds of unity and correspondingly different forms of diversity. And you could speak, for example, if you just go all the way down the hierarchy of being, you could talk about like the unity of an element. There is a stable structure with specific properties that belongs to an atom. And we recognize a unity like carbon and different from helium or something. And then you could look at another unity, which is a collection of atoms and into a mineral, has a certain maybe crystalline structure or something. And then you've got the unity of a living thing. It is still one, but it's not one like the carbon is one. In fact, there's a greater kind of unity here, because it not only has a stable structure and specific properties, but it also has a kind of interiority now. Like it as a living thing, it can grow, and it can even, in some sense, not quite like an animal, but it can adapt, respond to its environment in some way. So you see, there's this growth in unity to the plant, and then to the animal, where that interiority is deepened even more, such that it can become a storehouse of impressions of the external world. Memory, imaginations start becoming possible here. And then you have an even higher unity when you have the unity of the human being, where not only are we living and sentient and receiving impressions, but we're also rational. We can, reflect back on the data of those sense impressions and abstract universals, and there's an agency to our unity. And we also know ourselves as knowers. That allows us to have self-possession and to make self-gift in love. And that, I think, leads us to kind of the limits of the natural world that start to beg interesting questions that Revelation comes in response. Because the human person, we're clearly, I think, philosophically, a greater unity than the animal, the plant, and the mineral, and the element. But we're not yet the highest unity, because you see us striving for something which, we can, speak about in poems maybe, but we don't yet experience. What do I mean? So like, yeah, it's cool to know myself, to be in possession of myself, to be so unified that I can direct my own actions. But then I also long for unity with another person, that there is something still out there, a higher unity that I, in my individual autonomy and self-possession, don't yet enjoy. And so there's this greater unity where it's like I'm wanting to be inside the other person, and for the other person to be inside me, almost, where like I want to be known so deeply by that person. We have glimpses of that lead us, I think, to hope in human experience, where, in a really profound connection with a friend, we feel known in the way that we know ourselves. Or, there's this common purpose and goal. We long to have one mind and one heart, as if we were kind of one person, unified in a personal way. The highest human experiences are like teams, families, marriages, where you feel an interpersonal communion or interpersonal union. But there is something secondary to that. It is not the fundamental constitution of who we are. I sort of have to go out and search for that. And I think, arguably, I never really fully achieved that. I don't even know myself as well as I'd like to know myself. My own efforts of interiority are impressive, far more impressive than the animal, in principle, qualitatively higher, but I don't achieve the kind of self-knowledge and self-possession that I'm wanting. Obviously, I'm looking out for more, deeper knowledge, deeper freedom. And then so too, my communion with another, our interpersonal unity is not yet achieved. So I think if you stop there, it's like, oh my gosh, like it almost seems tragic. Like I'm longing for a greater communion than I can possess. And I think the Trinity is is a revelation that that's possible. It is God, one heart, one will, one mind, and yet a communion of persons. And so it's like, okay, it's out there, but that's cool. I'll worship that, but I'm still just me. And then there's Jesus Christ. Then there is this union of two natures, the human nature and the divine nature, in the mode of a person. And so there's in Jesus Christ, at least initially, there's this, hey, actually, your nature can be united to the divine nature without its destruction. Because the divine person, that personal existence, which is fundamentally dialogue with Father and Spirit, that can inhabit a human nature without its destruction. And then in the unity of the Spirit, that existence of the Son can become extended to all human beings that are united to him. And that personal life, that dialogue between Father and Son can dwell in me and become the new principle of my personal life. As Augustine would say, interior intimo meo, like he's now the deepest center of my personal existence. And I think that is the Christian confession, ultimately, to bring this long point to a close, the Christian confession that the unity to which we aspire as persons is what God promises. And it's a participation in his own unity, which is this communion of persons.
Just a small question. What language did you use to describe the kind of hierarchy as you go from an atom to an element to an organism to a non-rational organism to a rational organism? Did you say it's like a higher form of unity or something like that?
I did, or at least I wanted to say something like that. Yeah, there's a kind of hierarchy of being,
Yeah.
and I think you could map that onto like a hierarchy of unity. Things are more unified.
And I just wanted to clarify. So would you say that in the natural domain, there is no unity higher than the human person?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't really thought about what I would do with angels if we're considering them part of nature or creation. I haven't thought about that, but
Yeah, but certainly not. You certainly wouldn't assign a similar, you certainly wouldn't use the term a unity to describe a tribe or some group of persons who do have strong ties to each other,
yeah,
obviously, but
yeah.
they're not, there's a qualitative difference between, that's almost a metaphorical unity, I guess.
Although I think it is the higher unity to which we long to belong. Like I think that I suppose that the unity achieved is the personal unity where my as self-knower and a self-possessor and free and so forth. But I think that we are in our relationships to each other all revealing constantly how we're longing for a unity that we can participate in. And it's a new kind of unity because it's not simply the unity of a body. Like St. Paul's image I love, one body, many members. But I don't want to that is just an analogy, right? Like I'm not actually a kidney in Jesus, like a kidney is not a person. Like it doesn't actually possess itself and give itself away. And the kind of unity that St. Paul is trying to talk about with the analogy of the body is an interpersonal unity where the organs, so to speak, are persons giving themselves to each other in love. So it's not something that I see us achieving yet apart from that mystical reality of the body of Christ, which is a communion of persons, not a communion of non-personal organs.
It just occurred to me that I referred to a tribe, but then there are also man-made institutions, which are those are, in a sense, a more real unity in the sense that they're legal unities or something like that. But
we're kind of touching upon, in kind of the Aristotelian language that I'm more familiar with, the fact that we human beings are rational animals. From that reality also flows the fact that we're social animals, right? And so there's some communities which are natural to us, but if I can sort of put the finger on one of the contrasts here between us and the Trinity, it's natural to us because of reason to go out of ourselves in friendship and in tribes and extended family networks and societies and so on. But whenever that does happen, that's achieved contingently, right? And it can fare better or worse. And sadly, we can also fail each other as members of the communities that we're a part of. But of course, that's not true in the case of the Trinity, that it goes to the very heart of the identity of each of the persons that, as you were saying, Father John, it's not that there was a moment when the Father was not Father, and then by some further act, he becomes a Father or something like that, that this relationality is the very heart of God.
Yeah.
Good. Am I right then there to think that for you, it's really the fact that we have reason that enables us and maybe even drives us to go outside of ourselves and seek this kind of unity and diversity? It makes us seek friendship in the classical language?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think you could probably dig a lot out of the idea of us being rational. If we take the classical definition of man as a rational animal, and we just think that that means like, oh, he can calculate,
Right.
we won't get a lot of purchase on what we're talking about. But if you're able to connect our rationality to our sociability, or to our animality already to a kind of society, but then to a distinctly rational society, that a group of people or a group of beings that are in relationships through their mutual recognition of truth, goodness, beauty, these sorts of transcendentals where I'm going out of myself because I'm going toward goods that can bind us all together. I'm not just like an animal going out of myself because I'm hungry or something. I'm going toward these things that can bind us all together as spiritual creatures.
Right. So, it's precisely because I'm rational, actually, that I'm more available to others and able to open myself up more deeply
Yeah.
than even the most wonderful non-human animal could. As much as it's wonderful to have,
Dog.
a
Yeah.
loving and loyal
Yeah.
dog, right? Is that
Yeah.
there's that interiority which I can actually open up and make a gift of to others and seek for in others.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so rather than reason just being something that sort of pulls us away
Hmm.
and become objective and detached in a way that separates us from what we're interested in knowing, it actually can lead us into communion and participation.
Yeah, that's a
So,
great point. That's a
yeah,
great point because oftentimes don't we sort of degrade reason by saying, okay, let's just be rational, cold, collected, and that sort of means that we're creating a distance and we're objectifying everything. And actually, reason, most deeply understood, is the path through which we can come to mutual knowledge, and in that, a mutual indwelling.
yeah, that's a very rich point from your summation there. I wonder then, this has been sort of us laying out a Catholic understanding of how we can think about diversity in light of the Trinity, but then I wonder if we could sort of looking outwards talk about what word can Catholics offer to non-Catholics or to the wider public? Or how best do you think we could communicate about the difference it makes if we think about diversity in light of the Trinity?
Mhm. I think first and foremost, it's to proclaim the reason for our hope, like to acknowledge that we hope for this, and then to point to the reason for our hope, and in Jesus Christ. Um, and then so to encourage the conversation, I guess, and to be open why we're encouraging it. We're not encouraging it because we have simply some political desire or some social equality that we're pursuing. We're pursuing it because we think it's the nature of reality and we want to live in harmony with it. Like I want unity and diversity, not just because I want to make up for a past failure or something like that. I want unity and diversity just like I want to respect gravity. It's just the fundamental rhythm of creation. Um, so but it's a law, so to speak, of creation that you don't have access to from physics experiments, but from faith in Jesus. So maybe declaring the reason for our hope and being open about that. And again, how it's a kind of contemplative reason. It's something informed by faith. It's not something that we're doing because we have a very practical agenda to accomplish. And then maybe another thing we could offer is just the witness of the church, and doing our best to be a credible witness. But even in our worst days, it seems like we're still pretty darn impressive when it comes to unity and diversity. Like, we've got all kinds of sins and problems in our own hearts and everywhere else, and there's plenty of mea culpas that every Catholic can offer, myself certainly included. But even then, if you just consider the fact that we are one church through time and space of so many cultures and peoples and languages, and when you go to these big Catholic festivals, like, I've been to Seek in St. Louis. I've been to a charismatic renewal in Rome. I went to the Gregorian, where there were well over 100 different nations represented. I was in seminars with Catholics from Syria and from Eritrea and from every country you can imagine, South America and so forth. I've been to Mass in so many languages, and I have felt an immediate kinship with people from Vietnam to wherever else. And that's real. That's beautiful. And I don't know how many people apart from the church have that experience. And it's just a simple witness. Like, yeah, I've got friends all around the world. And when we meet, there is something really powerful that binds us together. There's a unity and diversity there in virtue of our participation in the church. I don't know any other institution that can boast that. And so not only do we have the faith that I think peacefully grounds the church, we also have a very powerful evidence of its possibility. This supernaturally sustained church. Notwithstanding all the counter witness that we as pilgrims will offer to it, God's promise is he's coming through on it, and the church is still around and still possesses this fundamental unity and diversity that gives us a right to boast, I think.
So rich, and yeah, I'm struck by how you led with just that initial move of giving the reason for our confidence and our conviction, and sort of that desire to respect reality, the reality of the logic of unity and diversity. I think even those of us who are Catholic or who want to defend classical understanding of these questions, we can take for granted that what we're trying to do is respect a truth that exists prior to us and that we'll find fulfillment in. But we really should make sure that we begin with those fundamentals and talk about why we're in this conversation in the first place, and why we have hope for its future.
It's just a quick comment on that. I sometimes find that when we do participate in conversations of social justice and things like that, it's usually on the mode of, well, I don't know, I don't want to generalize too much, but sometimes I think that it happens because there's a secular mission out there that we want to affirm, and so we join. And it's like, okay, this is a good end. Their practical end is good, so we want to join it and support it. Whereas we don't often, I think, say, actually, Jesus wants me. It's just the nature of reality, and therefore I'm going for it. It's like we're trying to make friends in the secular world, which is a good thing, but it's also just a natural issue from our faith, and it's an obedience to God and just the nature of reality to go out and pursue these things.
If I can maybe put it in a different way, it's something that we can be proactive about according to the own inner logic of where we're coming from. It's not just a response or a reaction, something on the outside.
We're not just playing catch up with a secular agenda.
Right.
Or we shouldn't be anyway.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And then also I'm just sort of digesting everything in your earlier remarks. That idea of the tangible witness of the church as an institutional reality, a human reality, as well as a divine reality, of course. That's certainly something for us to reflect more deeply about and to study more. I wonder then, maybe this is a good time to shift to the practical questions, the hope-focused questions, how to hope well and how to pursue good diversity well in light of what you've shared with us, Father John. And so again, the first question is pretty basic, but first I wanted to share another one of the gold passages that I've been coming back to from your pieces, Father John. A little further on in the same piece, you wrote that looking at the Trinity, we see unity and diversity are not things to be balanced quantitatively, as if they competed in a zero-sum game. They are ineffably reconciled in God. That is good news. That is the gospel. And then a little further below, you continue, some secular exponents of the human family appear to want implicitly to believe in this gospel. But the dream of being both one and many stems from a theological hope, something the secular world cannot justify by itself.
Mhm.
For by what reason do we try to unify a world of such different peoples? Who tells us that it is even possible for us to be one, and that we ought to spend our efforts for such a family? Why don't we give up hope and retreat into the loneliness of anxious self-protection? And as I read that passage again, I can think, of course, about cultural differences and differences between nation states, but also even just the epidemic of loneliness and the way that all the legitimate goods of technology that we have today can actually serve as an occasion of temptation to retreat and to fragment ourselves even more deeply. So thinking about hope, about the grounds for our hope, maybe we could just get started with the question of how do you think we can learn to hope better together, both Catholics and non-Catholics, for pursuing legitimate diversity and self-transcendence of self-gift in light of a greater community or a greater communion? How can we hope well together in light of what you've shared with us about the Trinity and unity and diversity?
The first thought that comes to my mind is the humility involved in hope. If you think, for example, I don't know, like you imagine like a high school sports team, and the guy, maybe you know what it's like to be on a sports team, and the instinct to just say, "Oh, we're going to lose," or like to set a really low expectation such that you don't look silly if you try and fail. And the guy who says, "I can win," or "We can win," he now looks like he doesn't know what he's talking about if he doesn't win. And so to hope for something so great is to expose ourselves. It's to become vulnerable. And only a humble person is willing to have a great hope. There's a pride in being cynical and being pessimistic. And I think we need to overcome that and have this like childish spirit where we're willing to hope for big things. But then I think that's a hope that kind of protects our love, right? The magnitude of your desire is now totally unleashed if your hope can match it. So that may be the first thing, is like be willing to dream, be willing humbly to hope. Don't feel like you're silly or don't care if people make fun of you for trying for something so beautiful as unity and diversity. And then I guess I keep returning to faith and this idea that I wrote there that's a properly theological hope. The secular world, I think, is kind of struggling because it still retains, I would say, the fumes of a Christian hope. This idea for the human family, this, dignity of all human beings. These are dreams that I think ultimately come from a Christian vision of the world, but it has sort of blindly asserted this immanence and independence and blindness to God that is threatening the coherence of that hope. Because I can hope in something because I love it so much and I'm willing to risk and have this like quixotic effort for it. But if I am honest with myself, I should recognize that I really can't guarantee this. Like I just don't have the strength for it. Moreover, I know that in principle I don't. It's an impossible task I'm setting for myself. If it's just me on my own merits or all human beings, with our own collective teamwork, we're not going to do it. And I think, for example, this is I think why in a kind of progressivism where you have at least ostensibly a really high hope, there is simultaneously a blindness to the reality of sin, and this presumption that all our problems are really just knowledge. Like, oh, if only people knew, if only we educated, or only if people knew what else was going on and we connected the right people. It's like, no, I'm sorry. Look inside. Like there's an illness there, morally speaking. I do what I hate. I don't do what I want. I'm inclined toward negative things. And I know I'm not the only one. We're all in this together. And so to be aware of the limits of our own agency. And that and so many other things, I think, just recalls the fact that this is a theological hope. This is a hope that depends on something above us. The Creator must want this, or else we're up the creek without a paddle. There is no pursuing of this dream if the author of the universe is against it. And you want to have a reason to think he's actually for it. You want to have a reason for this hope. And so I guess I return back to our where we began this point, just like the importance of being evangelical, of proclaiming the gospel, proclaiming, the reason for this hope in Jesus Christ, precisely in order to encourage the world. The world sooner or later is going to wake up, and arguably it is, I think, waking up in its despair to, the incoherence of its dream apart from God. And, I think we could be culturally at moments where people are just fed up with trying, and they're going to fragment, and they're going to say, to heck with it. This is, you're going to start to scapegoat, and you're going to start to deperson, and you're just like, this class of people or this political group, they're just fundamentally unredeemable, or they're hopeless, right?
Mm-hmm.
And thus I'm justified in cutting ties and moving off somewhere else. We need desperately to proclaim the faith that says, no, 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 as bad as he looks, as bad, you are fundamentally still human beings suffering from the same root cause of sinfulness. You're brothers, whether you know it or not, or accept it or not, you are brothers. And moreover, you are called to a common destiny. The Creator does not want you to give up. And in fact, he's doing all he is in history in order to realize this dream. Fight on his side and you'll be okay. Give up on his dream for you, which should be your dream, and you'll perish. I don't know. Did that help?
Oh, absolutely. Just on that last point, I want to make sure I don't caricature, but I have often also thought myself that absent that more complete theological perspective, often, people of goodwill can look around at the state of the world and they can wonder, why hasn't the progress happened yet? The progress I care about here in, the year 2024 with a kind of impatience, which can sometimes, to me at least, seem desperation.
Yeah.
Why hasn't it happened yet? All of these conditions are in place and, serious people of goodwill are working towards this. And yet those other guys are still not getting on with this, with the program, so to speak. And I think, both a knowledge of our fallenness, of course, not our total depravity, but of our fallenness and of concupiscence, but also the grounds for hope. Both of those can be remedies for that kind of desperation, I think.
Yeah. And it's I think it's, I don't want to put everything on Karl Marx, but I think that he is to blame somewhere for this kind of expectation where we can on our own power realize heaven on earth. And, if you have an eschatology without God, you're going to be very impatient very quickly. And you're going to look for political solutions and rely upon your own agency and constantly be disappointing yourself. And we need to detach from that and have a mode of politics that is more interested in God's project in human history and therefore more reliant upon him and more tolerant of our failures as we move toward his vision.
I do also, on a slightly different note, I want to highlight again from the beginning of your remarks just now, another point which was helpful to me, which is, tying intellectual humility and kind of that childlike trust with a willingness to kind of dream big and to sort of put some skin in the game and risk the possibility of failure or embarrassment. I've never thought about those last two things in connection with humility, but I can see it more clearly now. I think that's definitely actionable advice.
I think, I don't know if you want to spend the rest of the time on this or not, but just like where that insight I think has kind of come for me in my life is that, so in the monastery, obedience and humility, these are very important ideas. And I think sometimes at a superficial level, we think of those as, okay, Father Abbot, whatever you want, I'll do it. And it's like, what would you like? Oh, I'll just do whatever you want. And like the humble monk allegedly doesn't have a will even, like he just defers always. And I think that's a caricature very much of monastic obedience and humility. Like the truly humble man has a dream and then gives it away. He has a will. He presents it to the abbot. And if the abbot says no, he accepts it. He doesn't, for fear of being told no, refuse to make any ask. He has the humility to ask and hear a no. The proud man can't stand the no, so he never asks or never dreams.
I'll stop myself from going too long on this, but yeah, that reminds me of, I first heard this from Eleanor Stump in a paper of hers she gave, a Catholic philosopher, that rightly understood the Christian Christ's invitation to self-denial. It doesn't mean don't dare to form a will of your own or to have your own human longings. It means precisely, develop your humanity, develop your will and your heart, and learn to love good things. And it's precisely learning then to transcend that in light of something higher. That's where we see that.
Exactly.
Sort of
What do you have to give away if you refuse to grow?
Right. Good. Maybe on that note, I do have another question on this topic of hope. It sort of brings us more into that, Catholic distinction of faith and reason and revelation, nature and grace. And I know on this question, I think Brandon also had a few questions as well, so maybe we'll be able to segue in that. But we've been emphasizing the idea that ultimately the reason for our hope here is pointing us to the Trinity, which means the domain of revelation and faith, right? The Trinity is the secret of God's own heart, opened up for us in Christ. But I wonder, do you think there's room, kind of playing devil's advocate here for a second, is there room also for Catholics to see a kind of natural basis for harmonious diversity too? Obviously, we're going to hope and expect for a kind of higher unity and diversity through grace, but just on the level of the good of human nature as something created by God, do you think that there's room for something there? Or, maybe the answer is that it's just an unrealistically high expectation, given human weakness and sometimes even human wickedness, to think that there can be something like a stable human family. What do you think, Father John?
That's a great question. That touches on a lot of related questions, as you identified, about the relationship between nature and grace. And so, speaking in broad strokes, I would say that I certainly want to affirm a distinction between nature and grace, and I would therefore want to follow up all that we've said by saying that the Trinity is not like the answer to a philosophical problem, where, if we just thought long and hard enough about the nature of existence, we would arrive at, well, there must be a Trinity. I think it's more like a Christian philosophy where, faith in Jesus Christ now teaches reason to ask even deeper questions of being than it would have apart from him. And so it's tutored by faith that the philosopher becomes even deeper in his probing of existence. And then he does come to discover a coherence between the vision of faith and the vision of philosophy, but it's through questions that he never would have known to ask if he didn't meet Jesus Christ. So it's in that mode that I think we can try to articulate the coherence or correspondence between Trinitarian faith and these quote unquote natural desires for unity that we feel springing up within us. And then maybe a second point is that, there are all these controversies about nature and grace with the ressourcement theologians and de Lubac and scholasticism and that sort of thing. And, I a couple of years ago, I read a lot into that, and I'm sure there's more to it there than I understand, because at the end of the day, for me, at least 90% of the problem is solved fairly simply. And it could just be that I'm simplistic, but it just seems to me that there must be a metaphysical possibility of a pure nature, of a natural world untouched by grace and therefore no faith and things like that. But that, according to Jesus Christ, is not our world. God wants all men and women to be saved. So God is in one way or another impinging upon every human heart, making an invitation to participate in his salvation history. So we don't live in a world of pure nature. And that means, therefore, that the concrete human nature we go out and discover everywhere is the one that was created in grace in some fashion, like it was created with God inviting him or her in some fashion. And so that means that our access to this pure nature, in order to reflect on it and say, well, what would it have been like to search for unity apart from grace? What would have been our dream if we were just human beings in a pure nature? That is a pretty difficult thing. We just don't have access to that creature. The best we can try to do, but this I think gets us into a circle, which might be okay to some extent, but is to say, okay, well, I've got the human being concretely ordained to God, participate in Trinitarian life, but because that gift is a grace, there must be this natural nature in him that is in correspondence somehow to this elevated gift of grace. And so whatever that remainder is down there, I'm using language from Karl Rahner, like whatever the remainder is, once you abstract off the grace, that's what it is. But being able to make this distinction sort of presumes you're already above the whole system. And we can't really take that position. So it's with some tentativeness that we try to talk about pure nature. But I think that it's a fair project in principle. We ought to be able to see some kind of dynamism toward unity in the human nature, as difficult as it might be to identify its limits, its borders, and its integration with the supernatural dynamism toward our participation in Trinitarian life. So does that help, or is that way too abstract?
No. It all helps. I think about these sorts of topics you were touching on in this context, especially thinking sort of how do we translate, how do we make ourselves understood? Maybe I should put it that way, as Catholics, to the fellow human beings that we actually have, that living side by side with us here and now. So thinking both about sort of what is natural to us as human, but then also concretely, what's my neighbor like and how can I reach him? Those are the sorts of questions or the question out of which I think about these things.
No, I hear you. And maybe, so just in case some of the listeners just heard that last bit and are like, what the heck was that? Which I would totally understand. Maybe I'll back up to a more fundamental and I think accessible questions, like how do you know what is natural to the human being? What we think of what is natural as sort of what precedes and shapes our agency. What is common, repeated, what reveals a certain pattern. And okay, so that what precedes and conditions and shapes my agency, that's what I'll call nature. How do we know that all that precedes and conditions my agency belongs to this inalienable structure metaphysically that makes me to be the kind of creature that I am? Could there not also be other things that overlay that nature that are kind of like a second nature, so to speak, insofar as they precede and shape my agency? And I think that the Catholic wants to affirm both that there is this metaphysical thing called the human being, and if you change that, you've changed the creature. But that inalienable metaphysical structure that is human nature is not the only thing that shapes our agency. But there is something else that precedes all our agency and determines it all. That would be both the consequences of original sin, but then also more deeply the desire of God to give us an even higher power through grace, to make us capable of even higher acts than we would be capable with our nature on its own.
I will confess that as you guys were talking, my mind started like wandering into certain questions, and I just started writing them down. So what I want to do is I'll close just by putting a couple of questions to you, and then, I know you've got to go soon, so you can punt on them or just answer them very succinctly. That's fine, but it might be worthwhile to get these on the table. And they're not intimately related to everything you guys have been talking about. I'm really kind of bringing us back down to politics and culture, although there is perhaps a connection to be drawn, as Marcus indicated. So kind of two questions. The first is, I guess, from the point of view of a secular or scientific materialist, like a new atheist type, like Richard Dawkins. In fact, really the question is, I'm curious what you would say to Richard Dawkins if he said, we don't need God to value both unity and diversity and to seek both of those at the same time.
Mhm.
We know from science, specifically from biology, that humanity is diverse, divided into sexes. First of all, divided into individuals who are distinct from each other, into sexes, into racial groups. We also know from biology that humanity is one species. So we don't, furthermore, we don't need God to enjoy and value the differences between individuals, between groups, the sexes or racial groups. And we also don't need God to understand that at a deeper level, we're the same. We're the same species. But one thing about DEI that we've already discussed and that Marcus, RJ, and I have discussed with others is that adherents or proponents of DEI, it is not accurate, I think, to say that proponents of DEI or adherents of DEI enjoy and value the differences between the sexes or between human populations. First of all, they tend to say that the only difference between the sexes is biological, and that whether you're a man or a woman has nothing to do with your biological sex. So the only difference between a man and a woman is subjective identification. And any suggestion that there are other differences
Mhm.
is actually pretty ferociously resisted.
Mhm.
In other words, there's a real denial of a certain kind of intersex diversity. Um, and obviously proponents of DEI are also very resistant to the idea that racial or ethnic groups differ in any important ways. So they might enjoy certain kinds of differences, like differences of cuisine or of music, but the idea that the groups have different excellences or different axiological qualities is fiercely resisted. So DEI wants groups not to be different.
Mhm.
It wants groups to be the same. It seems like what it wants is professions, institutions, et cetera, each decile of the economy just to be represented by different groups equally. But at the same time does not wants to treat those groups as almost not groups, as the same, or the differences are quite limited. So in summary, I guess I'm asking, Richard Dawkins would say we don't need God to recognize and value both unity and diversity, at least with respect to human beings. Um, and then this question of DEI not really valuing or recognizing core forms of intergroup diversity. And I'm just curious, basically, what you would have to say about these things. And the last thing I'll say is that the question of intergroup diversity, I think we already discussed a bit in one of our previous conversations. So forgive me for kind of going back over that, but I'll stop there.
First, to the Dawkins point. So, I guess a couple things. One is I don't think Dawkins' metaphysics, as I've followed him, I've read, I think, The God Delusion and The Selfish Gene. And when I was, a young monk, I spent many hours engaging in apologetics on his website and the forums and stuff. It was a lot of fun. I cut my teeth in good ways. Um, but I don't think his metaphysics really can hold up the higher unities that we're talking about. The new atheists in general seem to me to be kind of like atomists, where everything just descends to particles in motion, and the self gene is essentially a machine. We living organisms are not really alive. I don't know if Dawkins has quite had that insight yet, that when you call a thing a machine, it's no longer alive. You might be right, Dawkins. I might be a machine, but if that's the case, I'm not alive, nor am I thinking, and all that stuff. This unity that is no more than the sum of its parts is a really low unity. It's not the kind of unity that has interiority and sensation and intellection and so forth. So I think that there's just really elementary philosophical distinctions that Richard Dawkins isn't aware of, that therefore leads him to say things where he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. His worldview does not admit the kind of unities that I think he would say he wants: friendship, love, knowledge, so forth. A second point is that
You don't think he would say there's something like emergent higher unities?
well,
Or
he
something
might
like
try, but if he's not willing to admit that his materialism is false. What's emerging? I think they usually, when they talk about emergence, it seems to me they talk about it only in quantitative metrics, like things are more complex. There's more parts. But a car with 3,000 parts and a car with 30,000 parts is still a car. It's just a machine. It's just a sum of parts that has no intrinsic formal unity. Um, that I find that's an insight. I got it the first time sometime in graduate school. I was like, holy smokes, like that was a real game changer. And it's not an easy one to get to. You really have to help tutor people toward it. And it seems to me that Richard Dawkins hasn't yet found that insight, the difference between a unity that is greater than its parts and a unity that is no more than the sum of its parts. It's just an aggregate. So that's a really fundamental principle. And, you could spend a whole podcast, I think, trying to help people toward that insight. But I don't think Richard has it. And so I don't think he's able to appreciate how he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. Second point is that, you can say you value this or that other thing, but if you don't have a reason for it, it's kind of arbitrary. It's just this act of the will. I choose to value. It's like, okay, that's nice, but it'd be nice also if you could do that integrally. Like if you could actually have a reason for doing it and not just choose to do it. And then similarly, I would wonder, what are you going to do, Dr. Dawkins, when these two values that you say you value, these two things you say you value, come into conflict? Are you going to give up on one or the other? Or are you going to stick in the game to try to hold on to both? And so when these values, quote unquote, come into competition, where are you going to be then? It's really easy to say you value them when it requires no sacrifice on your part to value them both. When in fact, it's quite easy. You can value them and feel very morally righteous and criticize other people. That's an easy time to do it. What are you going to do when they seem to conflict in your life? And then another point is that related to this is that I think people have observed that what we tend to take as common sense but we don't really reflect to the basics of it, and we just say, well, everybody agrees. Come on, nobody disagrees that you shouldn't kill people, or that rape is wrong, or these sorts of things. You're just like, just wait 50 more years of a godless society, 100 more years, and like we'll see where we are then. If you look at Enlightenment morality, for example, like when they got rid of revelation and when they got rid of like a kind of religion that where God would enter into history and you would have a personal relationship with him. So when we became deists or atheists, people still kind of thought that, okay, the fundamentals of human morality, we all still agree on those, right? Nobody doubted things about marriage or sexuality or, theft and lying and all these sorts of things. And you just fast forward, 100, 200 years, and a lot of that stuff is up for grabs. The things we used to take for common moral sense, we no longer do. And I think it's because we lost the justification for them. We lost the reason to really hold on to those. And it's to the credit of a figure like Nietzsche to point out that that's where things were going. When Zarathustra or the prophet descends into the market and says, God is dead, and the people don't recognize him, or the people don't understand what he's saying, and who is it that's drunk up the ocean and sent us without orientation and stuff? Nietzsche recognized what we had done after the Enlightenment, but it took a long time for us to sort of wake up to the fact that, oh yeah, like if you really throw out the creator, if you really throw out a transcendent principle higher than me, well, it does sort of become a competition of wills. And why should I be respectful or loving or obey whatever moral commandment you want to say? So I guess it's a long way to say that it may look to Richard Dawkins like he can have his cake and eat it too, but on so many ways, he really can't. And we need to probe the questions deeper so that we can actually have a solid, credible justification for the dream that we've got. And then to the second bit about, the desire of DEI advocates to really promote diversity. Obviously, it depends on, which advocate we're talking about. I imagine there's a great diversity among DEI advocates themselves. But I think I've experienced what you're talking about, where there's a way of talking about DEI that seems pretty hostile to diversities of at least a certain kind. And I'll just say one thing in their defense before I basically agree with everything you said. The thing in their defense is that I suspect that it's coming from a nervousness that as soon as you recognize a diversity of excellence, you're going to start putting them into an unjust hierarchy that suppresses one for the sake of the other. If we start recognizing differences between men and women, we're going to say one is better than the other, and we're going to, justify a power over one over the other. Or if we started admitting differences between cultures, we're going to start justifying a kind of cultural imperialism that overrides the freedom of a culture that can't defend itself against the more powerful one. So I sense that there's that that anxiety behind the denial. And now to just swing over to your point, I would say, well, yeah, an anxiety that we could mess it up shouldn't be a reason to deny the truth. We stand a much better chance of actually promoting justice when we're wide-eyed and we are checking our sinful tendencies, but we're not deliberately plucking out our eyes to avoid seeing the obvious. And it is very obvious that men and women are different. And again, I think, like we talked about in an earlier podcast, it can be very difficult sometimes to articulate those differences. But biology is real and it has profound effects on us all the way up and down. And we should rejoice in that diversity. If we trust the Creator, we will think that it was a diversity meant for a greater unity. If we don't trust the Creator, then yeah, if we think we're this accidental, product of a chaotic, cruel natural selection, then yeah, we might be suspicious that, well, shoot, maybe this diversity is not really meant for something beautiful. But if you trust the Creator and you believe in the goodness of your body and the body of the opposite sex, then you'll be open to an incredible mutual enrichment and complementarity.
That's a really interesting point you just made that I hadn't thought about. It's pretty basic, but that if you don't believe in the Creator, if you don't believe everything happens for a reason, let's say on a global anthropological scale, then it makes sense to be more concerned about intergroup differences.
Because if God's not in charge, then I am, and I need to look out. One of the most beautiful lines in Genesis is God looked upon it and said it was good. Like it was good, what God created. And it is very easy for us to come to doubt that what exists is good. And in philosophical language, that's the harm or the alignment of the transcendentals. All that is true and is good. And it's just so much fun to open up your mind and heart to being, to reality. It's exciting to be a human being, and we've sort of lost that childlike expectation. We come out jaded now, where we don't trust being. And so we have to try to refashion it and reshape it. And it's a terribly contradicting enterprise, because I am also a sharing being. I'm not my own author. I am. And just like I'm discovering the other, woman or whatever, I'm discovering myself. Like I too am one of the things in the world that my intellect is coming to know. And so this distrust of being in nature is also a distrust of the self, a suspicion of one's own self, which is just a sad place to be. And it ultimately, I think it's not warranted. How many times do you have to look at the beautiful, good creation out there and its intelligibility through science and whatever else before you'll be persuaded that there really is a wisdom stretching from one end to the other, ordering all things sweetly, as it says in Wisdom 7, I think, in the Bible. Notwithstanding, of course, the obvious fact that there's evil, that there are pox and moments in being where things don't live up to the measure that we know they ought. And yeah, I'm curious to hear from the Creator an explanation for that. But I think it would be unfair for the observation that some places in creation, things don't shine with the brilliance that they appear to be made for, as grounds to reject the creator and his whole project. That seems a little premature. Let's wait out for the end.
Well, feels providential. That's such a great note for us to end on, Father John. I just want to thank you so much again for sharing all of your wisdom and insights with us on these questions. Certainly know that I'm going to be looking back over and rewatching these remarks and this conversation to reflect more on. And again, yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, also this was so much fun. You guys are awesome. I felt pushed by you guys in really enjoyable ways, and I've learned a lot also from you guys. And again, I'm very edified by your work, and keep doing good things.
It's very mutual. I feel very blessed that we happen to become aware of each other. And I've learned a lot from everything that you've said, very like quite profound at various moments. And also, I just want to say one more time that I really hope that you and some of your students can make it up for the conference. I know that it may not be possible, but it would be fantastic if we could meet in person and you guys could be part of that.
Yeah, I'm hoping that still. When my plan is when you guys have a website live, something that I can, present to
Yes,
headmaster, that I'll be making that pitch.
it'll be live early next week, and I'll let you know.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank
God
you,
bless.
Father
Thank you,
John.
See
Father
you next
John.
time.
See you next time. God
Bye.
bless.